Cash. Okay. Yep. Okay. So I'm back, doing a little bit more work here. Before I took a break, I had gotten the step stuff working the way that I wanted it to. It's quite nice. So next we need something kind of similar to this. So let's copy this. But so this is the same. This is still the radius. The ray's origin. Let's put this way off in the distance. And the ray direction would be this minus. What was my world position calculation? Breakout flow 2. Well, it's certainly doing something. Toward and beyond the object until it exits the atmosphere or reaches a maximum distance. Shadow volume or cone. Region in space where light is blocked. Determining where the rays intersect with the atmosphere's volume and how these intersections. Okay, for each point in the scene, calculate the vector from light position to world position. Normalize this. Normalize this. Okay, I guess I have some confusion. So if I am casting light source location, light, so, light source location, I would expect we could use the sphere intersection function from earlier. However, the output of that function is two distances. Obviously, these distances need to be translated so they are from the of the light rather than the camera. How do I go from to a light? Can you give me an example implementation? What position minus the light position, normalize. Okay, I have that. Calculate intersect. Light position, light to atmosphere ray, and the atmosphere radius in the center, of course. Check if there's an intersection. No, I don't think that is quite right. You could visualize the issue this way. E. Okay. So our issue here is we have like rays of light coming this way. We have a camera going this way. We have a bunch of rays of light coming from one location. And a camera observing it from another location. The sphere intersection output for the rays of light are in distances rather than world positions. We need to be able to calculate the area that would be in shadow from the intersections with the depth buffer. Alright, let me go get my pupper that wandered upstairs. I did. Okay. Buddy, you get into too much, girl. Okay. Contact object's world position lies within the distance. This is also in a post process. Depth of each people, the expected depth of the life of direct.
Let's look at movies from an expert's perspective. You're thinking beyond food. Imagine being germ-free. Rheogenesis technology. It's on Cinema After Cinema. Me, your host, Tim Heidecker. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode.
Estimate light direction.
Tim Heidecker.
Simulate shadow effect based on light direction. Shadow strength. Shadow color.
From the VFA, Greg Turkington. Hey guys. And also with us is a new expert that I'm bringing to the show, a technology expert, and Max. What's your last name again? Max from Comco, coming to us from Best Buy. That's a Best Buy we all know is a terrific store that provides all kinds of technology and TVs, all that kind of stuff. VCRs, because they're the ones that actually discontinued. We don't use VCRs anymore. Yeah, but because of places like Best Buy, they gave up on the format, even though people were still buying the tapes. Well, let's respect our guest here. The reason I have Max here, last week we delved into the Ready Player One from Mr. Spielberg, and it turned me on to this world of VR that I really didn't know much about. And I went down to the Best Buy, and Max here, just a killer salesman, and got me into a new, what is it, 70-inch Samsung, which is 4K, and a couple other great devices, HDMI cables he got me onto, and a whole bunch of stuff. Universal remote from Logitech, just a ton of great cool stuff. But the reason I went there is to find out about VR, because I thought this is the future, and I love being a little bit ahead of the curve. So talk to me quickly about VR in a minute. I wanted to make a quick note and say thanks to Rheogenesis for making the show possible, rheogenesis.com. People have been asking me, by the way, because I kind of mentioned this very quickly about my process with the Germ Shield X, the powder, the shake that I've been making. I wanted to give my official recipe for what I do. You guys are going to go with the Germ Shield X powder. This is the shake I make. I make it 2 or 3 times a day. Basically, real simple. I take a big scoop of the Rheogenesis into your blender, some ice, some almond milk, like a couple cups of almond milk, or whatever, real milk. You want to do real milk? A couple of peanut butter. A couple. Sometimes I put in a banana.
Cone from depth buffer UE5.
I'm telling you, it's better than a McDonald's fantastic. It's such a delicious, got a little sweetness to it, and it's got nutrition, and you're blocking germs. 100%. Some germs are good for building up. No germs. No germs.
Is it possible to make our post-process material react differently based on the existing light volume?
First warning, I don't do second warnings. I'm gonna do it for you now. That hat, any of those goddamn promotional hats end up on the set again, you're off the show. Now, VR. Sorry about that, Max. This is very disrespectful, I think, to be wearing these hats. We don't look good in either. Well, the hats are everyone's saying that unofficial popcorn classics. So I'm getting a lot of letters to the contrary. These are unofficial popcorn classics. You're too busy talking about this Dr. Sand garbage. It's not that you probably found in his estate sale. I'm trying to include popcorn classics. Shut up, I'm not going to read that later. I'm not going to let you read that later. Max, I apologize. Talk to me about VR. We brought one of these here. This is a VR unit set. What is VR? A lot of people are like, why are they preaching VR? What is virtually real technology?
Okay, so boop, boop, boop.
This is black right now. This is if this is hooked up to movie or whatever. This would be another level of movie sim 360, correct? And this is the. Would you agree? You said this to me at the store. I thought it was in town. This is the future you think of entertainment? I think so. Yes.
Okay, so where was our?
That's the trend. It's the definition of this, where we're going. So, thank you for this. Thank you for the demo. For education. That's let's quickly get to your.
This was our depth buffer.
As everybody knows, what's going on with Tim Burton and Sherlock Holmes controversy, I took the liberty of writing an open letter to Mr. Burton, which I'm going to read this week, and then next week hopefully we'll have his response. Mr. Burton, thank you.
Yeah, this isn't gonna work because these are just in distances.
And if you really read my letter to whether or not Sherlock Holmes
Okay, let's try again. I have the sphere intersection distances given a light at a specific location and
please do not insult my intelligence any fans by assuming that you do not know this fact. It is disingenuous for you to pretend that a major studio would produce a new Johnny Depp film without first asking you if you were available to helm the project. Millions of dollars, hold on, millions of dollars and potentially tens of thousands of jobs hang in the balance of any major film production. But have gone with James Stevenson, an unknown director, instead of proven Depp collaborator and confidant. It is a decision that no studio executive would ever make voluntarily. We are left to conclude that you declined of your own volition to work on Sherlock Holmes for reasons that you did not explain, that I feel is substantial entitled to say. Thank you. To conclude, as I stated in my first letter, my program Monster and Entertainment is at this time a premier source of movie expertise and criticism on the web and television. We have a very large viewership, enthusiasm for film. Excuse me, you said letters into a film box. Generally, these are film boxes. Generally, you've seen the movie several times. If the movie film box line film, I hope that you will not disappoint them with further evasiveness. I look forward to your future projects with Mr. Depp. Sincere regret that Johnson, Mathis, and a co-host. So this letter just getting into the question, why did you not hear Sherlock? No, yeah, that's clear. We got that. But he didn't even consider. Thank you. Thank you. That's the first letter. Thank you. So hopefully this gets. Thank you. Thank you. Read that. Yeah, I love it. All right, with this one. Which they already have in the history, so it's not as much technology. All right, I can start as well. Well, we'll see. I don't know if anyone's interested in my new show or that relationship in me. All right, let's get into movies. First up, Patrick Pride. Patrick Pride. Chachaquatic, Chichichat, quit it. I was going to say there's a movie about 500 times, but you saw the movie. Starring Kate, directed by John Florian, starring Kate John,
James, please. No. I
Jason
don't have a
Bateman,
shirt. Oh, no.
Kennedy.
That hurts, dude. Yeah, but you got little claws and you dig them into me, dude. Don't whine. Don't whine that I boot you off of my chest when you're clawing into me. That's a little. That's a little ridiculous. Ow. All right. Okay.
This is a story of Ted Kennedy. It's the life and times of Ted Kennedy, and sort of trouble he got into.
Need a sphere intersection
To see
for
some
this.
finally this guy get
Given the world positions calculated from the depth buffer, how can I create light?
should have got a death penalty, but he ended up dying of natural causes.
Can I output a
Couple years ago.
value
Go, by the way. But
for any
interesting what
area
done in preventing those kinds of issues. Uh, that's all I'll say about that. So I think like the video tennis is starting off. Greg, I give a 5,000.
the light is in, and then uh, light position. How can I calculate value of 1 for everywhere the ray of light impact with it being 0
So I did really like it. I would give it
when
5 bags of popcorn and an inflatable life preserver to save yourself if you ever find yourself in a situation.
it being 0 and past any point along a ray that has impacted the depth.
You were never really here. Greg Turkington story. Directed by Lynn Ramsey. Starring Joaquin Phoenix. A traumatized veteran, unafraid of violence, tracks down missing girls for a living. When a job spec
Light pixel direction for each pixel.
overtakes him as a conspiracy is uncovered leading to what may be his death trip or healing. So it's either one of those two.
Any object blocking the light from reaching, since you cannot cast razor in the light's perspective. Oh, oh, sorry.
Sherlock Holmes.
Depth of the. Alright.
Tell you one thing, directed by Lynn Rand. I felt like I was in this movie because it's a very memorable film to see. It's one of the scariest movies in recent years, one of the most horrifying, one of the most real. And I only hope that none of us and none of our viewers ever live through anything like what the characters in this great movie lived through. I'm going to give it 5 bags of popcorn, maybe a prescription to see if I
Okay, let's try that. So this is our normalized world position, but we don't actually want that. We want a regular world position, so we've got dot cam position minus cam position minus world position. Normalized got the vector. I think this is it. And then step point 5. Eddie, come on. Can I not get rid of this? Jesus Christ. Point 5.
Finally, big news. Thanks to Max, who's been here checking out and sort of figuring everything out. Max has agreed to set us up with our own VR rig here. So next week, hopefully by next week, I think we'll be able to enact this, put this into action. We're going to be seeing, for the first time ever, on cinema at the cinema in VR. So wherever it takes, you want to get your, I don't know, whatever your rig is, get this, or Max, you recommend this. This is Samsung or Oculus, whatever you want. Get the unit, because next week we're throwing out all the cameras here, getting rid of all the equipment here. Watch it the regular way still. You cannot. It'll be in VR. Prepare. That's the future. I'm not waiting around for it. Thanks, guys. See you next week. So we're going to get the movie review. They have to buy this. But we're not going to the show. Yeah. Everybody has a. It's a lot of things that they do to go buy some of the things. You don't need to get the car. You don't just, push it forward. You don't need something like that to watch the show. You shouldn't need something. You shouldn't, but you will.
Hum, 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 hum. No, that doesn't really work. No, that doesn't really work. I'm not sure if I'm phrasing this right. We have a point. The light location. We have some world space coordinates derived from the camera's depth buffer and location. We need to figure out the area we needed with any light rays that would beyond their initial or any light rays that would project beyond their initial um, any light ray area that would be beyond initial vision with the depth
It's amazing. Yeah. It helps us randomly select movies.
being in shadow.
Yeah, let's talk about it. Okay, what is this one? The title's Intersoft
Interface. It's not just another fantasy game. These players are serious. Dead serious.
I am too.
Yeah?
About not watching it.
Oh, man.
What's after that?
Nailed it. We got Dark Universe.
This is sure ripping off something.
Yeah. Then we got after last season. It's just two people looking sad.
Pixels world position, calculate. Yeah, we do that. Calculate the distance from the point to the light source. Compare this distance to the depth buffer value at that pixel.
Then we got Black Scorpion, starring Joan Severance.
Severance, that's a good show.
That's not what this is.
No. This looks like a combination of Catwoman and Batman. It's clearly a superhero movie.
Yes, and the tagline is just.
Okay, do not use shorthand. The parts you have put in comments are the parts I'm actually trying to figure out. Putting a comment that says do this is useless.
I think this Stone Cold part is confusing me because there's a wrestler named Stone Cold.
Okay.
Steve Johnson? So, is that it? It kind of looks like Val Kilmer from Weird.
Val Kilmer?
No, Kilmer.
Rich. This is Val who goes into a kiln.
Val Kilmer.
There. Kiln.
For each pixel, calculate the vector from the light source to the pixel's world position.
Interceptor force. How do you stop the unstoppable?
We got interceptor force and we got an interface.
Ernie Hudson.
Oh, really? I hope we land on this one.
Yeah.
I always love an Ernie Hudson.
I always love an Ernie Hudson's look.
Yeah, Ernie Hudson vehicle never lets you down. And then we got Bob.
Okay, so
I'm pretty excited about it.
we have our light location minus our world position, distance.
Picked for the board, even though DC, it's an assignment movie that's, I guess, a take on that Roman Denver movie.
No, vector length.
I watched this like with my friend that like a sleepover in high school, so I remember it being incredible. I hope that plays up. If it went on, it's just insane.
Rich was looking forward to this.
Oh yeah.
When the year he was born. Less, but not least.
Divided by a lot.
Okay, I didn't see that one. Really? I heard it. We're gonna watch it all 3 times. Yeah. Yeah, and you're gonna find up that letter behind the other thing.
Okay. So you do now?
Yeah, sure, I guess. All right. Ready, Cap?
Come on, dog. You do it.
Fucking good. 100 million to be seen. $1 million.
Oh my god.
When is this? Yeah, I'm getting emotional. What the fuck's happening? Whoa.
He's also getting sick from the camera. I used to be America's dad. Now I'm here in the valley with you fucks.
This is Griffith Park. I've done this hike. Bob. Oh no, it's Bob.
Free marching. Craig Shadow. Okay.
Who? Holy shit. All right.
You must try Miro. Before Miro, work got lost across different tools. Monday, Jira, Slack.
In this video, and now we end up with Cube. Give us a trial. And I'll see everyone again in the next video. Materially one up in Z, one over in X, and one this way in Y. So our light position should be like here, casting down on the object. So that's essentially what I'm defining here. 1, 1. And we're going to detect that we're within the position of this object, or when we're intersecting with the surface, we're going to define the normals of that surface. So the normals will equal normalized ray origin minus the sphere center. And that's going to calculate our surface normals. And then we're going to use those normals to shade the object with lighting by doing a float, which will be our diffuse value. So diffuse is going to be the strength of the light on that surface. If the diffuse is 0, it's going to multiply that red color by 0 and just end up being in shadow. It'll be dark. If the diffuse power is like 1 because it's facing the light direction, then that part of the sphere will be red times 1. It'll be fully red. So that's essentially what this variable is going to do. So it's going to be the max of the dot product of the normal and our light direction. And then it
That's about all I remember, but I remember being a real proud kid. Walked up to people in some event to take place at 100 million. Well, just wait. Just wait. You don't know the twists and turns that this takes. This goes everywhere. Right.
Seriously, no. 10 more minutes and
The weak energy condition will continue to expand until it absorbs everything.
no.
Never. Saying this is to stay with my close support.
Remember me? That was the shot. Like directly out of the Tucker Brothers.
Yeah. This says scientists discover time travel with horrible consequences when they inadvertently bring a giant carnivorous dinosaur back to modern Los Angeles. Oh, I guess that different with all the twists and turns. Yeah. Or by reading what they gave me. They go back in time and they bring something back. What's that little blurb on the front say? Oh, the blurb says an elite military team sent back in time. They will not return. That's what they got Google it. I don't know if you guys remember that deep. Well, it's probably the accurate. Yes.
Hey, man.
Are you ready?
Are you ready?
Are you ready for the Google for Games Developer Summit?
Red light is equal to 1 over the wavelength to the power 4 multiplied by the scattering strength. And I'll do the same for green and blue. Now, this could happen anywhere along the view ray, but in order to calculate it, we'll need to pick a finite destination. But as the optical depth increases, more and more light will get scattered away, and so we'll see an exponential fall-off in Cyclops with its purplish atmosphere, so let's head over there next to take a closer look. So that's essentially all there is to see for now. I think the atmospheres have improved the look of the planet substantially, so I'm happy with it as a starting point. But I'm also very curious to read through some more recent works on atmospheric rendering, because the write-up I've been following dates all the way back to 2005, so I'm sure there's been plenty of new ideas and approaches since then to experiment with. I'd also love to add some fluffy little clouds and varying weather conditions to the planets, not to mention plants and animals. Plenty to keep me busy for sure. Anyway, that's all I have for now, so I hope you've enjoyed this video, and until next time, cheers. Then for the floor of the crater, I'll just have a straight line which I can shift up and down. Now to combine these three equations together, I'll make a crater shape function, and this will first take the minimum value between the cavity and the rim, resulting in this, and then take the maximum value between that and the floor, which gives us the overall shape. The lack of transition between the functions makes the shape really harsh and unnatural though, so several episodes ago, back when I was experimenting with ray matching, I learnt about the smooth min function for blending shapes together. This function just takes whichever is smallest between A and B, but with some smoothing applied, controlled by the parameter k. To make this return the max instead of the min, you can just make k negative, by the way. So if I use that for my craters and increase the smoothing parameter, you can see it looks a lot more natural. I now just need to translate that to my moon height compute shader, and behind the scenes I'm also now feeding it a buffer containing a random position and radius for each crater, plus all the various settings it needs. Then, going into the scene, I'll increase the maximum radius, and we can see a single crater appear. Let me add in a bunch more of these, and to try get them looking a bit more crater-like, I'll mess about with the rim width and steepness parameters, and then also the smoothing amount to make the shapes a little less harsh. That's looking okay, so I'll add in a bunch more of them. It looks terrible now, but I think what would help is if smaller craters were a lot more common than larger ones. So I'm generating a random number between 0 and 1 to determine the size of each crater, and if we pass that value into this function that I'm graphing here, we'll just get out the exact same thing we put in, because y is equal to x at every point. So that's pointless. But here's the code for this function, and as you can see, it's controlled by a parameter called bias. The bias is currently 0, but as I increase it towards 1, you can see how the curve changes. So now most values we input to the function will just get a small output, and only a few will result in a relatively large output. Back to the moon. I can now use this little slider to change the distribution of the crater sizes and make small craters more common than larger ones. The last parameter to play around with is the floor height, and currently this affects all of the craters, but I'm going to make a little change to have the floor height determined per crater, just to add some variation. Alright, that was very long-winded, but we now have some fairly cute little craters. The moon is exceedingly smooth at the moment though, so I want to add some little bumps and ridges using noise. The noise function I'm using just takes in a point in space and gives back a value between -1 and 1, which changes smoothly as you move the point around. The code for that noise function, which is not something I wrote myself, looks like this. Very confusing. Anyway, we can make multiple layers of increasing detail by spacing the sample points further and further apart each time. If we combine all these layers into one, well, it's a bit of a mess, but if we make it so that each layer contributes less and less to the overall result, we get some nice structured and detailed noise out of it. The code for that looks like this. We can do some fun things with it. For example, we're sampling the noise function at a point in space, so what if we offset that point using more noise? Well, as it turns out, this warps the noise in pretty cool ways. If you add a bit of color and animate some values, you can get some pretty stunning results. Modifying it another way by taking 1 minus the absolute value of the noise results in a more ridge-like appearance, useful for, well, ridges and mountains. I had some fun playing around with different colors and just watching the noise scroll by. Just for fun, let's try use this to create something similar to Hyperion, one of Saturn's less threatening, lumpy, spongy-looking moons. So I have some different noise settings over here, like the ridge noise I was just talking about. This has a bunch of parameters I can play with, like the scale and the power. Looks great. We can also subtract the ridges instead of adding them, which I think looks kind of interesting. Anyway, to get a kind of lumpy shape like Hyperion, I'll add some simple noise and scale the frequency way down. I can then offset the sample position until I get a shape that I like. I'll then also add some higher frequency noise for a bit of detail. Hyperion had a lot of holes punched in it, so I'll put the number of craters way up to something like 3000, and it's quite amazing that my terrible crater code, which loops over every single crater on every single vertex, is actually still running reasonably quickly. Anyway, here's my little rock. If I want to add more detail without increasing the number of vertices, I'll need to use textures. So typically, someone creates a 3D model and then painstakingly adds seams to indicate how it can be unwrapped into 2 dimensions. A talented artist then draws details on top of that, and we get our beautiful result. To bypass the annoying unwrapping step, I'm going to try use a technique called triplanar mapping, and the idea is to just use the position of the model's vertices to read from the texture. Of course, the position is in 3 dimensions and the texture in 2, so over here I've just picked the x and y axes of the position to sample from the texture. This gives great results when we're looking into the xy plane, but from other directions it's somewhat less convincing. So the idea continues. We sample the texture 2 more times using the zy and xz axes. Now we just need to blend between these 3 different textures to favor whichever one aligns best with the surface, which we can do based on the surface normal. We can also raise the normal to some power to affect the sharpness of the blending, and multiply the position by some factor to control the scale of the texture. If we look at the sphere now, you can see it's blending between the projections, but the result is kind of muddy, and that's what the sharpness parameter was for. I can fiddle with that and get it looking how I want. Also, if I change the scale parameter, surprise surprise, it scales the texture. I'll grab one of those textures from my warp noise experiments to use instead. This needs some lighting, so I'll quickly go back into the shader and calculate the dot product of the surface normal and the direction towards the light source, and then multiply the output color by that. This looks a bit bland though, so I'd like to spice things up with a normal map. I did some research on how to get that to work with triplanar mapping. And once again, Ben was there to guide the way with this very detailed article on the subject. So here's the triplanar code now modified to work with normal maps. In my fragment shader, I can then get the normal from the normal map and use that to calculate the lighting. I found these two handsome maps online, so let's try them out. Immediately the surface looks a lot more interesting and detailed than it really is. Here's what the other map looks like. So I'll switch over to my actual moon surface and raise the strength of the normal mapping. Here I'm actually using both normal maps and blending between them based on some noise to try break up the repetition a bit. What I'd like to do next is add some color variation, so I've generated some noise which is stored in the mesh UVs, and using that I can split the moon into two color regions. I also have some settings for warping that noise because I like warping everything now. One little detail I wanted to add is these cool looking rays of ejected material you can see around relatively young craters, before exposure to space darkens them and they fade into the background. To do this, I randomly pick a couple of craters to have this feature, and I then did some slightly suspicious maths to calculate UV coordinates around them, like so, and it can then sample from a texture to draw the rays. This doesn't look great to be honest, and it only works for a small number of craters, but it's better than nothing for now, I think. There's clearly still a lot of room for improvement of the moons, but I'd like to move on for now and begin creating some little planets. So I'll write a little shader that just uses the fractal noise from earlier to create some landmass shapes. I'll smooth out the lower values to create an ocean bed, and then I'll multiply all heights below 0 by an ocean depth parameter. I'll then also add in some ridge noise for mountains, and finally add those noises together and write it to the height buffer. So here's the noise in action. I'll deepen the oceans and flatten the floor a little, and then I'll go into the ridge noise settings and push up some mountains. The only trouble is the mountains have kind of taken over, and I'd like to retain some flatter areas. So I'll add another layer of noise to act as a mask, and I'll multiply the mountain noise by that mask. So now if I shift the mask around, I have some control over how abundant the mountains are. Here's what the mask actually looks like, by the way. Now, I'm not sure what the best way to handle the oceans is, because I want the player to be able to go underwater. What I'm going to try for now is doing it as a post-processing effect. So after everything else has been drawn, this shader will be run for every pixel on the screen, and in here we can access the camera's depth texture to figure out how far away everything is, otherwise the ocean would just be drawn on top of everything. I then collaborated with Stack Overflow to write this little ray sphere intersection function, which can tell me the distance to the surface of a sphere, and also the distance it travels through it to the other side. In my ocean shader, I'll then use that function to figure out how much water we're actually looking through for the current pixel. If it's more than nothing, I'll draw white, otherwise I'll just leave the original color. That gives me this. To add some color, I'll go back to the shader and use the depth of the water to blend between a shallow and deep color, and also blend in some of the original color in shallow regions to give a soft transition at the shore. So I can control the transparency with this parameter, and the blending of the shallow and deep colors with this one. I can also obviously change the colors. Now, I'd like to be able to see the sun in the water, so I looked up the equations for specular highlights and decided to go with the Gaussian model because apparently it's slightly better. Citation needed. The calculation is kind of expensive though, primarily because of this arc cosine function, which I hear is a big no-no in shaders, so I might replace this with a cheaper model later. I'll then also add some diffuse shading and apply this lighting to the ocean color. So I can now use the smoothness slider to control the size of the highlight, and behind the scenes I also added in some wave-like normal maps using that same triplanar technique from earlier, and that gives a kinda nice effect. It would of course be a lot nicer to have actual waves rising and falling, but I have no clue how to do that, especially using this technique on a sphere. Something to look into for sure. Now, with the way I've done this, it is possible to go underwater, but the effect is quite underwhelming at the moment. Still, I'm going to call it good enough for now, and move on to coloring the terrain. In one of my old tutorial series, I tackled this problem by assigning colors based on elevation, but this results in kind of silly looking bands of color. I've learnt at least one new trick since then though, which is to consider the steepness of the terrain, calculated as the dot product between the surface normal and the up direction at that point. We can then make grass, for example, appear only where the steepness is below a certain threshold. I do still use the elevation to not allow grass to grow too high up, and also to add some slight color variation. Something I've been struggling with a lot is the look of the mountains because they look too smooth. I tried adding in a rocky normal map, but it looked a little bit horrendous. In an earlier iteration, I experimented with flat shading and also adding a threshold so that only steep regions would be flat shaded, but I wasn't so happy with this either. Ideally, I'd like to use a technique I experimented with a while back where you simulate hundreds of thousands of droplets of water to try and mimic the effects of erosion. Just thinking about the changes I'd have to make for this to run on a spherical world seems like it'd become ridiculously slow though, so my latest attempt has been this kind of cartoony effect, with solid bands of colour to try emphasize the rockiness a bit. I'm not sure if that's the style I want to go for or not, but I've been experimenting a bit, adding for example this sort of speckled effect to the grass. Up close you can see the terrain looks a bit raggedy, so I do think it would help if I could increase the resolution some more. I have several levels of detail that I can switch between, but that's just for the entire planet, so I think I might need to break it up into chunks after all. Headaches await me, I guess. Anyway, we can of course randomize the planet shape, which just works by changing where in space the noise values are sampled from. And we can randomize the colors, although the combinations can sometimes be a bit of an eyesore. I've then also been having some fun generating other little planets and moons to fill up my test solar system. For example, here's one that I've nicknamed Cyclops because of its one giant crater. I quite enjoy just messing about with the settings and seeing what happens. As you can probably tell, there's a lot of warping going on in this one, so I'll play with that parameter a bit as well. Cyclops has a little moon, based on those Hyperion experiments from earlier. There are a bunch more, but I'm quickly going to hop over to Blender and try whip up a blocky little astronaut so we can go explore them properly. I'll get this imported into the game, make a build, and oh no, what have I done this time? Well, that was weird, but here we are by the home planet, and alongside it is its little moon. I'm going to see if I can zip over there quickly. Well, let's go see what's out there. Looks like a whole lot of nothing. I'll head back to the ship because there's not actually much to see here, but maybe several episodes down the line there'll be some little life forms to gawk at or something. For now though, I'll just hop over to the next door planet. Oof, good thing I haven't added a damage system yet with the way I pilot this thing. So obviously things are kinda wonky looking at the moment, but if I can work on the graphics a bit and add in some trees and bushes and maybe some little life forms as I mentioned earlier, I think it could potentially be a nice little place to wander about. For my last stop on today's journey, I'll fly over to the twin planets which orbit up close and personal with the Sun, and I'll go pay a little visit to the Fire Twin. that's going to be all from me for today. Obviously, there's loads of things I could do to improve the look of the moons and planets. I just wish I knew what they were and how to do them. But that just means there's loads left to learn, so I'd better get to it. As always, I hope you've enjoyed watching, and until next time, cheers.
Meet Asana, a work management platform that helps companies get more done and save more time. Teams can stay connected while they track updates and visualize timelines. Asana, a smarter way to work. Try it for free today at asana.com.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Coding Adventures. Space is frustratingly big. If this is the Earth, the Moon is all the way over here, and Mars is several months' travel further out. It'd be much more fun to explore if the Moon were about here instead, and other planets were a little more accessible too. Because of this, among other grievances, I've decided to make my own solar system. First, we need gravity. So I'll start with this famous equation, which says that the force with which two bodies attract one another is equal to big G, the gravitational constant, which in the real world is this tiny number, but it can be whatever we like, really. That's then multiplied by the mass of each body and divided by the distance between their centers, squared. To translate this into code, I made a little script which holds some information about each body, like its mass, radius, and initial velocity. I then have a function for updating the velocity, where I just loop over all the other bodies and calculate the force using that equation from a moment ago. Acceleration is just force divided by mass, so these masses actually cancel out, but I'll keep it separate for clarity. Finally, the velocity is increased by the acceleration. I have one more tiny function in here, and this one just moves the body using its velocity. The reason I have these as separate functions is that I then have a simulation script which first updates all the velocities and then all the positions, which I found was a lot more stable than updating each body's position immediately. There are fancier ways of doing this. For example, I looked into something called leapfrog integration, but it didn't seem to make any difference at all, so I guess I was doing it wrong. Anyway, let's mess about with this a bit. So if we have a planet and a moon arranged like so, the moon is of course just going to crash straight into the planet. But if I raise its initial velocity on the y-axis, I can get it to sail further and further until eventually it misses the planet entirely and goes into orbit. Raising the initial velocity even more will make the orbit increasingly elliptical until finally it's going so fast that it escapes the gravitational pull of the planet. I could also give the planet some initial velocity, so now both bodies are moving through space. Lastly, I'll try raising the mass of the moon, and we can slowly see the path of the planet begin to undulate a little. So with two bodies, the orbits are fairly simple and predictable, but if you add in just one more, suddenly there's an explosion of complexity. I had a lot of fun playing around with different starting configurations, but inevitably there would be a collision or one body would shoot off and I'd end up with just two bodies orbiting each other in the same repeating pattern. And I began to wonder if there were any scenarios in which that wasn't the case. So I did a little research reading the 3-body problem page on Wikipedia, which led me to this paper in which is listed the conditions for one possible stable orbit of 3 bodies. So I'll move the bodies to their described positions and starting velocities, and you can see how this simple figure-8 orbit emerges. I'd been playing around for ages and just getting crazy chaos, so I was pretty blown away by the fact that such a simple orbit as this actually exists. Okay, time to make a solar system. So I'll start with the sun in the middle, and I'll duplicate that out here and turn it into a blue planet. I'll of course set its radius to be a lot smaller, and then I need to set its mass, but I have no idea what that number should be. So I've rearranged the equation from earlier to calculate mass given the radius and the acceleration due to gravity on the surface. I want this planet to have a gravity similar to Earth's, so I'll set the value to 10. Finally, I'll increase its initial velocity until it's going in a nice orbit around the sun. Now, this causes the sun to move as well, so I've got an option in my display script to draw everything relative to a certain body, which it just does by subtracting that body's movement each iteration. And so if I set that to the sun, we can see the blue planet's orbit more clearly. Now, I'm going to add another planet nearby, and my goal is to make these two orbit one another as they go around the sun. I'm trying to do this by adjusting the initial velocities, but so far it's not being very cooperative. I'll just keep patiently tweaking though until it behaves. This is looking better, but I want the orbit to be more circular, so I'll raise each body's velocity bit by bit until it looks right. With some small tweaks, we can get different patterns to emerge, which I think is kinda cool. It's not very clear though what the planets are actually doing here, so I'll quickly go back onto my visualizer tool and just increase the number of iterations up from 0. I guess I could also just let it play out and see what that looks like. This is sped up quite a lot, but I think it's looking good so far. So zooming out, I'll add in a little green planet and adjust its velocity to bring it into a circular orbit. I'd like this one to have a moon, so I'll zoom in on it, make a copy, and make that a lot smaller. Then, as before, I'll muck about with the velocity to get it into orbit. But it's pretty difficult to tell from here if I'm having any success, so I'll set the orbit display to be centered on the green planet, and I can then try talk it into going into a circle. Okay, I want one last planet for now, a large purple one with a relatively high surface gravity. I see it's making the green planet and its moon wobble a fair bit, so I'll move it a little further out where it can't cause so much trouble. I think I'd like this one to have 2 moons, just for variety, so I'll go ahead and create those. Zooming out and seeing the orbits like this, you can imagine how perplexing it must be for the purple planet people, looking up at the sky and seeing these peculiar loop-de-loop orbits. One day they'll figure out that the sun is actually at the center, and it's going to make so much more sense. Looking at the moons of the purple planet, especially the inner one, I have a hard time believing it's actually going around in a circle, even though I know it's true. I guess it's the way it appears to abruptly change direction that throws me off. So I made a camera follow the purple planet around, just to be sure. Isn't it cool though how all of this arises essentially from this one kind of unimpressive looking equation? Anyway, I'd really like to be able to fly around and visit the planets, so I opened up Blender and created this rather ugly space exploration vehicle. And if I zoom in over here, you can see it has an equally ugly interior. But there's a fire extinguisher, so at least it's safe. I then coded up a simple controller. This is the input code here, which just lets you thrust in all directions, and also rotate the ship with the mouse. Then over here, I make the ship be affected by the gravitational pull of all the planets, and apply the thrust and rotation to the ship's rigid body. So I can now hop into my ship and fly about. It can be quite tricky to gauge how you're moving relative to the planets, so I want some sort of UI to help with that. I've recently been playing a brilliant game called Outer Wilds, and that's essentially what inspired me to mess about with this stuff in the first place. But more to the point, I'm going to shamelessly steal the way that they handled the UI for this, which is that as you point your ship towards a planet, you can see these little markers around it, and if you actually press on it, then you see some important information like your distance from the planet, how fast you're heading towards it, and with these 2 arrows, how it's moving relative to your ship. As you can see, I also added in some distant stars, and I'm aware they look pretty terrible. It's literally just 3,000 spheres spawned really far away. I'd like to experiment with something better in the future, with not just stars but maybe distant nebulae and so on. But for now, I'm just going to attempt to make a graceful landing on this green planet. Well, that was anything but graceful, but in any case, I'll get out of my seat, open up the hatch, and step out onto the surface. Like the ship, the player is of course also affected by the gravity of all bodies, but one way it's different is that it finds which body currently has the strongest gravitational pull, and aligns the player's up direction with that. Anyway, there's really not much to see on this planet, it is just a sphere after all, so I'll hop back over to my ship, close the hatch, buckle in, and take off. So obviously the solar system is not terribly interesting to explore at the moment, but I'd like to change that by replacing the bland spheres with some procedurally generated planets, and maybe adding in some little creatures, or I don't know how far I'll take it yet, but it seems like it'll be fun to work on. I'm going to leave all that stuff for future videos though, because they deserve their own episodes. Well, here we are on the moon. It looks just like the planet, except it's grey, and you can jump really high, of course. The last thing I'd like to talk about for now is precision issues. It's a problem that plagues space games or any very large open world really. The issue is that the larger a number gets, the less precise the decimal part of it will be. And this can lead to wonky physics and wobbly rendering when the player is very far away from the center of the world. For example, here I have the ship on my outermost planet, 50,000 units from the origin, and as you can see, everything is jiggling like there's no tomorrow. So my crude fix for this was just to make a little script that checks how far away the player camera is from the center of the world, and if it exceeds some threshold, just move everything in the scene back to put the player at the center. The physics engine was not a big fan of that idea at first, but with a little bit of tweaking, I was able to get it to behave. So in the editor, I have that threshold value set to 1000 at the moment, but just to demonstrate, I'll set it to something really small. And now, as I pilot the ship, you can see that it's staying pretty much fixed at the center, while the moon and everything else moves around me instead. Of course, from the player's point of view, everything looks normal. So, that's all I have for now. It's all very crude and patched together. The planets don't even rotate yet, because that made my player slide around weirdly. But I've been having a lot of fun playing with this, and I'm excited to take it a little further, so I hope you've enjoyed watching, and until next time, cheers. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Coding Adventures. Today, I'd like to take a look at portals. This topic's been on my mind lately because I was looking through some of my old projects and came across this portal effect which I was very proud of at the time, but which is in fact quite remarkably terrible. Mainly because the view through the portal doesn't remotely align with what you should be able to see. So to try figure out how to do this properly, I'm going to start with a simplified 2D view of the problem. I have a blue portal over here facing one direction, and a red portal facing some other direction. Then there's the player camera, and I'll shade in the region that it's able to see through the blue portal. So in that space, it should be seeing the world from the perspective of the red portal instead. And one way to achieve this is by adding in a second camera to actually draw that part of the world. Now, one of the many mistakes in my original attempt was placing the camera so that it always looked out from the surface of the portal like so. But if we want its view to align with what the player should be able to see, we need to move it back over here to where it has the same position and rotation relative to its portal as the player camera has relative to the portal that it's looking through. I find maths can be confusing, and I struggled a bit to actually calculate this at first, but what I ended up with was a series of matrix multiplications to get the player camera's position and rotation relative to the blue portal, and then to see where in the world that lands us in relation to the red portal. With these two lines of code, I can now move the player around, and the portal camera will update to maintain the correct position and rotation relative to its portal. This also of course works if I move or rotate the blue portal itself, and same story if I move or rotate the red portal. With that figured out, I created a little 3D test world with a simple player controller so I could run about. There are two portals, and each one has a screen for displaying the view from the other portal, and that view is drawn by each portal's camera. Right now, the camera's view through the portal is blocked by its own screen, of course, but I'll fix that in a moment. First, I need a portal script to manage all of this stuff. In the script, I'll tell the portal camera to render what it sees to a texture called the view texture, and then that texture will be assigned to the screen of the other portal. Now I'll disable the camera because I want to control it manually, so just before the player camera renders the world, I'll call the portal's render function, and in here we should start by hiding that screen object that was blocking the view. Then we should make sure that the view texture has been created and has the right size, and then position and rotate the camera using that matrix stuff from earlier. Once that preparation is done, we can instruct the camera to go ahead and render what it sees to the view texture, and finally re-enable the portal screen. That's not quite what I had in mind. It is yelling at me in the console that I forgot to assign the screen object to the portal, but I'm not quite sure why that's causing this to happen. Anyway, I'll assign the screen, and we're now left with a much more boring result, but it's a little closer to what we want. The issue at the moment, though, is that it's taking the view texture from the blue portal and just mapping the entire thing onto the screen of the red portal, like so. It does this, of course, because a regular old shader uses the UV coordinates of the mesh to do texture mapping, and here we have 0, 0 on the bottom left, up to 1, 1 on the top right, so it's going to put the entire texture on there. What we can do instead, though, is use screen space positions, which look like this. As you can see, these go between 0 and 1 on the X and Y axes based on where they are on the game screen. So if we use those for the texture mapping instead, it'll be like taking the view texture and just cutting out the region that overlaps with the screen of the portal. And that's perfect. So this is the current portal shader, and I just need to change a few lines to get it to calculate the screen position for us, and then I'll calculate my screen space UVs by dividing both the X and Y screen positions by the W component. I've always found this a little mysterious, it's just what I've learned you have to do, so I'm going to come back to that in a moment. If we play the game now though, it at last appears as though you're actually looking out through the other side of the portal. They don't exactly take you anywhere when you walk through them though, so that's going to be the next task, right after I get some idea of what this W is doing in my equation. So I've been reading up on how 3D objects get squished onto a 2D monitor. To try and understand this a bit, I have a camera and a model plane. As long as the model is inside of these white lines, which is the camera's view frustum, the camera will be able to see it. Now, the camera has a projection matrix, and the goal of this is to squish everything in its view into a little unit box. If I apply that projection matrix, this happens, not quite achieving the goal. But the result of the projection is actually a 4-dimensional vector with the fourth component, or W component, being proportional to the distance from the camera. If we divide the position of each vertex by W, it's now inside the box. This box is useful because it's easy mathematically to tell if a triangle is outside the box, in which case the GPU doesn't have to waste time shading it in. And also, if we just ignore the Z component, we now have a completely flattened representation of our 3D model, which can be drawn to the screen. Hopefully everything I just said is accurate, because my understanding is still a little vague, but I think I've got a better idea now of what this perspective division is all about. I'd really like to learn more about the rendering process though at some point, because it's something I always just take for granted. All this talk of rendering does make me sympathize with the poor GPU that has to render not just the player's view, but also the view from every portal. One small thing I can do to alleviate its suffering is check if the screen of the link portal is visible from the player camera, and if not, I can skip rendering that frame. The visible from camera function will work by calculating the 6 planes that make up the camera's view frustum using the handy geometry utility, and then check if the bounds of the renderer is inside or intersecting with those planes. I came across this technique on the Unity wiki, and while I have no reason to believe that Michael is trying to hoodwink me, it doesn't hurt to make sure that it's working how I expect. So I'll quickly make a 1x1 texture, color it red, and apply that to the screen if it's not visible. If it is visible, I'll set it back to the view texture. So now, as I look about, the portals should turn red the moment they're no longer in view of the player. And I can't complain, it seems to be working perfectly. What I will complain about though is that I'm getting sick of looking at these cubes, so I've spent a little time making some low poly trees and cacti and stuff, and made my testing environment a little easier on the eyes with a forest region and a desert region. I also may have got a tiny bit sidetracked and started working on a silly little system for low poly clouds. If you put on some relaxing music, I find they're actually quite pleasant to watch. But we don't have time for that. It's 7 minutes into the video, and you still can't walk through the portals. So I've created a little class called Portal Traveler, and anything that wants to go through portals should inherit from that. Then in the portal script, if a traveler comes close, it gets added to a list of tracked travelers, and if it leaves, it gets removed from the list. Every frame we can loop over all the tracked travelers to figure out if they should be teleported or not. So essentially, we just need to check if the traveler is on a different side of the portal this frame than it was on the previous frame. We can do this by looking at the angle between the portal's forward vector and the vector from the portal to the traveler. On the one side, it will be greater than 90 degrees, and on the other side, it will be less than 90 degrees. You might be familiar with a super useful bit of maths called the dot product, and one property of this is that the result will be positive if the two vectors are pointed less than 90 degrees apart, and negative if they're pointed more than 90 degrees apart. So in the code, I'll calculate the traveler's offset from the portal, and also update the previous offset, and then I'll use the dot product to check which side of the portal the traveler's on now, and which side is on previously. If those sides are not the same, then we can do that matrix stuff again to figure out where the traveler should end up, and call the teleport function. Alright, it's a historic occasion. Our brave test subject is about to enter the portal for the first time. The crowds are gathered, and the band is ready. Filled with grief and rage, I began debugging and realized the reason for the traveler's unfortunate demise is that this function that detects when an object leaves the portal depends on the internal physics loop, which runs on its own fixed time step, so there's no guarantee that it will run every frame. For this reason, the same portal ended up teleporting him multiple times, resulting in him being flung unceremoniously into the void. Well, it's working now, but as you might have noticed, there's sometimes a momentary flicker when going through the portals, which spoils the effect a bit. This is caused by the portal screen intersecting with the near clipping plane of the camera, allowing you to see through to the other side. So what I'll do is make the screen actually be a cube. It doesn't need to be nearly this thick, of course. I'll use this bit of code to make it just thick enough to not clip with the camera. Now, a small problem is that if we go inside the cube, it's no longer visible, making the whole thing pretty pointless. However, if we go into the portal shader and add this cull off instruction, that will tell it to draw the inside of the cube as well, and we should now be able to go through portals, reverse through them, and even waddle in sideways without any artifacts. So this is looking pretty good from the point of view of the player going through the portal, but if we're observing something else going through the portal, it looks terrible. First of all, we need the object to be cut off as it goes into the portal. So I'll create a surface shader called slice, and in there I'll add a slice center and a slice normal variable. And in the input struct, I'll request to be given the world position. Then we can calculate the dot product of the slice normal and the direction to the current pixel, which, just like telling which side of the portal the traveler is on, will give us a positive number on one side and a negative on the other side. This clip function in the shader will discard the pixel if the given value is negative, and so I'll pass in that dot product value. While I've been writing this, the car's been struggling tremendously to drive over a little rock. 10 out of 10 for effort though. Anyway, to see if the slice stuff actually works, I'll make a little test script which just passes the parameters to the shader, and now I should be able to move this plane around to cut off one side of the mesh. It does seem to work, but I'm getting some strange shading on the clipped side, so I did a bit of research and discovered that I need to use the add shadow directive instead of full forward shadows. Perfect. Then I'll need to make a temporary clone of the traveler so that it's able to disappear into one portal while simultaneously appearing from the other. Once the transition is complete, the clone can be discarded. Finally, I'll set the traveler's slice parameters from the portal script like so, and I'll cue up some old-timey music so we can sit back and watch the result in style. Now, there's a pretty big issue that I've been avoiding for a while, which is that if there happens to be an object between the portal camera and the portal itself, then that will block what we're able to see through the portal, completely spoiling the illusion. I had no clue what to do about this, so I started looking at other portal implementations online, and I came across a great article on Tom's programming blog, at the end of which he talks about something called oblique projection. Reading up on this, the maths went way over my head, but the idea itself is very simple. By default, we can adjust the distance of the camera's near-clip plane, which lets us cut stuff out, like so. With some fancy matrix magic, however, we can actually rotate the clipping plane. So, of course, if we just align the clipping plane with the portal, then nothing will be able to block the camera's view through it anymore. The code for this is pretty simple because we just need to calculate the desired clipping plane in camera space, and then Unity thankfully has a function for calculating the projection matrix from that. Just for fun, I added this custom clipping plane stuff to the camera projection test from earlier, and played around with that to see how it affects things. Anyway, with stuff no longer able to block the portals, it was time to move on to the last effect I want to achieve for now, which is recursive portals. In other words, when you can see the portal you're looking through the portal you're looking through. Currently, it's showing whatever was on the portal screen last frame, plus whatever is in front of it this frame, so we get this weird effect where we can kind of draw on the portal by moving around. That's not what I want, of course, so imagine we're looking at the blue portal over here. This means we're seeing the view from the red portal, and from there we can see the blue portal, which shows the view from the red portal, and so on, making an effect like this. Now, we can maybe achieve this by rendering the view once and repeatedly scaling it down or some sort of trickery, but the problem comes if the angle of one of the portals changes. Now the view through the portal will be deflected, and when it goes through the portal, it will be deflected again and again. So in that case, I don't think one can get around the costly process of just rendering the scene multiple times from different points. Here you can see how these points change based on the angle and position of the portal. So in the code, I calculate these points by repeatedly applying the transformation that takes us from the player's camera to the portal camera. And the number of points is just determined by this recursion limit value, because we've got to stop somewhere. I then loop over those points, and each time set the portal camera's position and rotation, and then render its view. So on the first iteration, it renders from the furthest point, and that's drawn onto the portal, then that gets repeated for the next point, and the next, and so on, until we have the full effect. Now, there's still the question of what to draw on the portal on the first iteration. At the moment, I'm just drawing it black because I can't think of a clever solution. One could maybe make the light fade with each iteration, but I'm not so happy with that either. Anyway, it's obviously extremely expensive rendering all of these extra steps, and so I'm at least going to add a little check to see if the other portal is actually visible through the portal, which is just done by calculating the bounding boxes of the portals in screen space and comparing those. Well, that's all I have for now. There's loads of room for improvement and expansion, but I'm pretty happy with what I have so far. I hope you've enjoyed watching, and until next time, cheers.
With the Wells Fargo Active Cash Credit Card, earn unlimited 2% cash back on purchases you want, like dance lessons.
Ow, ow, ow.
And on what you need, like memory foam inserts. Ah, that's real life ready. Visit wellsfargo.com/activecash. Terms apply.
I was staring at my screen the other day, waiting for inspiration to strike. I wanted to make a game, but my mind was frustratingly blank, so I thought maybe I could get the computer to come up with some ideas for me. I began by creating a list of possible characters, like celebrity, scientist, rock star, professor, and so on, to be the heroes and villains of the game. I then listed some character descriptions to add a bit of flavor, as well as some genres, themes, and goals. As I went along, I began developing a simple syntax for certain things. For example, comma-separated entries inside square brackets represents a list of options to be picked from randomly, Or if I say defeat at character, that indicates that a random character should be generated in its place. In total, I ended up with these 15 categories and spent not a small amount of time filling each out with a bunch of entries. The most important category is the templates, which determine the different ways that elements can be joined together to form a sentence. To complete these templates, I have some code which first reads the contents of each category into a dictionary and then picks a random template and fills in the tags. So, for example, the character tag gets replaced with a call to the generateCharacter function, which just picks a random character and also has a chance of adding a description to it and of turning the character into a group of characters for some variety. So say we start with this captivating template, a mood game about theme, set setting, where you play as character goal. Let's see what this turns into if I let it run. I thought it might be fun to share this online, so I have my little HTML file which gives me this in the browser. To make it less hideous, I added a style sheet and started searching how to write CSS, because I've actually never done this before. With a little bit of trial and error, I was able to get it looking how I wanted. I think I'm ready to launch my web development career.